Hello everyone, welcome to week 2. This is our first lecture, probably of 2 that we'll do this week, where we're continuing to introduce some ideas that help us understand food in an interdisciplinary context and give us kind of some lenses, some different ways of understanding food, thinking through food that help us to kind of see its complexity, the richness, the details that we can get from it from the social science, natural science, and interdisciplinary studies perspectives that we're going to be using this semester. So we start off with the food diagram as one lens, and this week we want to introduce a related lens, the idea of political ecology, that we're going to use to help understand and talk through, think through food systems in a couple of different examples. Political ecology as a concept is a way of thinking about, as the name would imply, the political, economic, and ecological dimensions of a particular system. And the idea is that you can't really separate economics, politics, and environment. You have to really look at them in an interdisciplinary way like we're doing in this course because they're interdependent factors and you can't extract them. Basically, the idea is adapted from the Marxist concept of political economy. Marx was one of the first to really argue that politics and economics can't be separated, and in a lot of ways, political economy is a critique of classical economics and the idea that you can just analyze economic systems, especially in terms of supply and demand, in a purely rational way, where people act rationally according to maximizing their own personal interests. What Marx said and what political economists have argued since then is that it's really kind of artificial to separate those in that way, that all political systems have economic dimensions and vice versa, that economics is something in particular that you can't analyze without really seeing the different political structures that shape economic systems. That maybe seems kind of obvious, right? It's not really a huge surprise to us that politics and economics, and now we're adding an environment or ecology, are interdependent with each other. However, it's kind of a way of trying to emphasize that so that we don't get stuck in one disciplinary lens and that we see that we can really get some benefits by looking at those together, even though there might be some downsides in terms of maybe our analysis being a little bit more abstract, more complicated, harder to give a straightforward or simple answer to the question of why does food cost what it does if we wanted to buy a loaf of bread or a gallon of milk. From a purely economic point of view, we might be able to kind of say, well, here's the supply, here's the demand. In a political ecology approach, we would be looking at the laws, the regulations, the ecological footprint of those food production systems and try to understand them together, which obviously can be more challenging in some ways. It might mean that we have answers that are more complex but less precise in some cases. Because we're using this Marxist lens, it means that embedded within this perspective is this idea of conflict and conflict approach to understanding political, economic, and ecological conditions. And the idea is that resources are scarce. People compete over those resources, and therefore built into a lot of our different social, economic, political, ecological systems is this struggle over scarcity, where people kind of try to get what they can, and sometimes that means preventing others from getting what they want to have. So in this view then, power and privilege are built into things like food systems, and we can analyze them in that way. This is a little bit different view of power than we often think of it in kind of everyday life, where if somebody has power over someone else, they can kind of dominate them or control them. And that is one way of understanding power, is your ability to exercise some kind of force or control overtly over another person or a group of people. But power can also be analyzed as something that's more kind of hidden, still powerful, but built into systems and maybe less overt in that way. A good example that is in the news a lot in discussions about racism and racial structures is this idea of structural racism. Sometimes in the past we referred to this as institutionalized racism, the idea that race and racism aren't always things that are expressly or overtly stated or acted on, but rather there can be structures that are embedded into our everyday lives, the things we take for granted, and the ways that power is exercised that are more hidden, are more built into the structure of a system. Political ecology and the way it conceptualizes power is in that same way, that it's looking at power as kind of built into systems through their both social structure in terms of institutions, laws, cultural beliefs and values, but also the more material aspects of a system as well. How are ecological systems and services, resources used in a way to help give some people power and maybe limit or restrict the access to power or goods for other people? Could be the same with bads, that power is used to kind of prevent some people from being exposed to bads like environmental toxins or toxic waste, but that other people have less power to control the presence of those bads in their lives. So you can see a connection here if you know anything about environmental justice and the idea that goods and bads in terms of environmental services, environmental resources, environmental risks are unevenly distributed. There's a really strong connection here with the way that economics, politics, culture, and ecology fit together. So let's try to make this a little bit more concrete. I want to talk about an example that we're actually not going to read in class, but it's one that I know a lot about because I wrote it. It's my first book project that was based on my PhD thesis research that I did when I was in graduate school way back in the day. In the 90s, I went to grad school at UC San Diego in California, and I did research in an area called the Salinas Valley, which is kind of between San Francisco and LA. There's a really productive agricultural space where a lot of our fresh produce for the whole country is grown, raised, harvested, and sent off to other places in the world. So if you get your lettuce or your carrots from Common Thread, you're not part of the system. However, if you go to Price Chopper and you look at a package of lettuce, you look at celery, you look at carrots, chances are good that it actually says on the package from a company in Salinas, California. Look next time you're there, or really any grocery store around the country. There's a good chance that your produce of certain types is coming from this place in the Salinas Valley. So I wrote this book. You can see the cover of it on the screen here. Cultivating Science, Harvesting Power was published in 2008. And what I did is I wanted to understand how this one little valley in California became such a productive and an important place for supplying fresh produce to all different places in the country. And one of the things I found is really significant there, which is reflected in the title and in the cover of the book, is the role of science and technology in creating this system. So in the book, I really looked carefully then at how is it that scientists and people who develop agricultural technologies worked hand in hand with the farm industry to develop a system that they could produce all this food. So you can see here a map that shows you a little bit about where the Salinas Valley is in California. You can see up here is the Bay Area where those inlets are, and down here is LA and San Diego. So Monterey County and the Salinas Valley is this whole string of communities from Salinas down going towards San Luis Obispo that are in this valley and are a really good place for creating vegetable crops. And so a lot of the most productive places where the most lettuce, most carrots, most strawberries, most garlic for the whole country comes from this one little valley nestled in California. So I spent a couple of years actually doing ethnographic fieldwork, lots of interviews, lots of analysis of historical documents to look at the interactions between the scientists who worked there with the University of California system and the farmers who run that system, and the folks who work with them too. So here you can see in this picture an example of a couple of agricultural scientists. One of them is here pointing at the ground. The other is standing with the purple rain pants on with a clipboard taking some notes in a field of celery where they're doing an experiment. You can see there's some tape here that says, do not enter, do not pick. That's to kind of set off one little test plot from the rest of the field of celery so they can try out these different experiments and see how it works in terms of producing the celery crop. The other people around them in the yellow rain suits are actually migrant farm workers whose job it is to harvest the celery. So they're kind of working alongside them in this one little plot to cut out the lettuce, grade it according to different sizes, and then take notes about how much you would get from this plot where they've applied a certain treatment. In this case, it was to test out a new, more environmentally friendly type of pest control on the celery crop. The concept of political ecology was important for me in this study because I wanted to know how it is that this system of production and ultimately power got created through the relationship of the farmers and the scientists and others who are part of this system, including the farm workers. So one way of thinking about this, I'm kind of a visual learner, visual thinker, so it was helpful for me to kind of think through in a visual way how this system works, and maybe it's something that helps you understand the concept of political ecology too. An artist friend helped me develop this diagram, and I apologize, the quality is not very good. I couldn't get a better scan of it working from home as I mostly am during the quarantine period, where we tried to map out in a visual way what does the power system in this particular production space look like, and especially how do the different elements fit together and create a system where the farmers and the scientists themselves as well have power and privilege that comes from a lot of different interdependent, interdisciplinary elements. So you can see at the top it says an ecology of power, but really the diagram kind of starts at the bottom, and you can see some elements from the food diagram in here, things like place. There's stuff like water and soil and plants and biota that are all coming from a particular place in literally the ground. And then you've got actors who are working there, people like the growers in their pickup trucks and the scientists who also have pickup trucks that they go through the fields. They're putting in place experiments on the one hand. On the left side of the diagram, the growers are growing their food. In each case, those things that are put in the land and kind of grown or taken from the land create things like commodities that lead to wealth for the growers, for the farmers, or for the scientists that lead to knowledge and expertise and influence through the university system for the scientists. In each case, they then have influence, capital, and ultimately power that come from the wealth, that come from the knowledge and expertise that allow them to influence things like the State House. You can see up here on the upper right is state.gov. That's the California state government, who themselves influence both the scientists and the farmers through regulation, but with their expertise, with their wealth, the scientists and the farmers also influence the political process. So there you go. In one picture, we've got things like politics, economics, ecology, that all come together to help show how from a particular place and your control of it, your use of it, your cultivation of it, you can develop power in one form or another. That's an ecology of power. So hopefully that helps you maybe see the political ecology lens in a little bit more specific way. And really, it's kind of another way of illustrating the food diagram. Like we said in class last week, the food diagram, I think, is a useful lens, but it's it's kind of an abstract lens. It helps to take particular commodities or particular production systems for food or consumption systems and put them at the center point and say, okay, more specifically for the case of where lettuce comes from, how can we use that to really understand the different dimensions, the different pieces of the puzzle that really help us to understand and be able to analyze where that food is coming from. So the food diagram can be kind of put into different formats. It doesn't have to be these boxes and arrows. It can be a little bit more illustrated in a specific and dynamic way through this ecology of power that was part of my book project and my study of the Salinas Valley. So then for us to talk about, we're going to be reading a very brief analysis of the pandemic and especially the role of wet markets. And this has come up in class a couple of times already where we've briefly talked about the influence of the pandemic. And we want to think about it in the terms of the lenses that we're using here. So the question that I gave you in class last time when we concluded was to think about how we can use the food diagram to help understand the pandemic, but we can also use this political ecology lens in the second question here to say, are there ways that we can understand the structural aspects of power, privilege, inequality that are built into our food systems that are being revealed through the pandemic? That's something we'll discuss in class. Hopefully on Tuesday we'll have some time to talk about that in the tent, and we'll have one more lecture, I think, that'll talk about some additional aspects of political ecology related to the other readings for class this week. More on that soon.